Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
Before electric light, before illuminated streets and glowing windows, winter was not simply a colder season. It was a transformation of life itself. For much of human history, darkness did not arrive at night and leave by morning. It settled in for months at a time, stretching evenings, erasing hours, and reshaping how people slept, worked, ate, and even thought. In the long winters of the past, most people lived in rooms barely lit by firelight. Candles were rare. Silence was common. Time was not measured by clocks, but by hunger, exhaustion, and the slow return of the sun. In this episode, you'll learn what winter was truly like before modern light, not through legends or myths, but through the quiet, often overlooked details of everyday life. You'll hear how people navigated nights so dark they could not see their own homes from across a yard, how they slept in two distinct halves, waking naturally in the middle of the night, how firelight altered faces and shadows, making familiar rooms feel strange, how silence itself became something people listened to and sometimes feared. We'll explore how winter changed food, memory, work, and the perception of time. How entire homes were rearranged to survive the dark months. And how patience, waiting, and endurance became learned skills, not philosophies, but necessities. This is not a story of danger or drama. It is a quiet history of adaptation, of how ordinary people lived through a season that modern life has almost erased. As you listen, you may notice how different this world feels from our own. How constant light has shortened our nights, compressed our sense of time, and removed the long stretches of stillness that once defined winter. Settle in. Lower the lights around you if you wish, and let yourself drift into a season where darkness was not feared, only endured. Winter, before the age of electric light, was not experienced as a series of short days and long nights, but as a slow transformation of the world itself. As daylight retreated, it did not simply shorten hours of work or leisure, but dissolved the familiar structure of time. Morning, afternoon, and evening blurred together, replaced by vague intervals of grey light and extended darkness. For many people living before modern illumination, winter felt less like a season and more like a condition that settled over life and remained there, reshaping habits, thoughts, and expectations for months at a time. In much of the pre-modern world, the disappearance of light meant the disappearance of certainty. Without clocks, glowing windows, or artificial markers of time, people relied on subtle cues that modern life has erased. The angle of the sun, the color of the sky, the length of shadows, and the sound of church bells or distant animals all helped establish where a person stood within the day. During winter, many of these cues vanished or became unreliable. The sun lingered low on the horizon or failed to appear at all for long stretches, and clouds and snow erased what little distinction remained between 1 hour and the next. This loss of clear timekeeping changed how people understood their own lives. Tasks were no longer performed at specific hours, but when light allowed or when the body demanded rest. Meals shifted according to availability rather than schedule. Sleep arrived earlier and lasted longer, broken naturally by waking periods that felt neither wrong nor unusual. Winter nights did not feel like interruptions between days, but like a continuous state that wrapped around everything, pressing gently but persistently against human routines. The darkness itself was not always feared, but it was deeply respected. People understood that vision was limited, and that movement in winter carried risks simply because so little could be seen. Paths that were familiar in summer became uncertain under snow and moonlight. A short walk could become disorienting if landmarks disappeared beneath drifts or fog. Many avoided unnecessary travel altogether, not because of danger in the dramatic sense, but because winter darkness demanded patience and caution rather than haste. Inside homes, the retreat of daylight forced life inward. Rooms were not brightly illuminated spaces, but dim interiors shaped by flickering firelight and shadows. The edge of vision was rarely clear. Faces appeared and disappeared as people moved closer to or farther from the hearth. Walls absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and ceilings vanished into darkness above. In this environment, the concept of seeing clearly was relative. People grew accustomed to working, eating, and resting in half-light, relying on memory and touch as much as sight. This constant dimness altered perception, colors dulled, textures softened, movement slowed. The human eye adapted, but never fully overcame the limitations imposed by winter. Objects seemed closer or farther than they were. Shadows shifted with every movement of flame. Familiar spaces could feel subtly unfamiliar after nightfall. Not frightening, but quietly strange. Over time, people learned to trust their surroundings without fully seeing them, developing an awareness rooted in experience rather than clarity. The absence of reliable light also affected emotion and thought. Long nights encouraged inward focus. Conversation slowed. Silence became common, not as an absence of activity, but as a natural state of being. People listened more closely to sounds within the home and beyond it, distinguishing between wind, animals, settling wood, and distant movement. Winter trained attention toward subtlety, reinforcing the idea that stillness was not emptiness, but a condition filled with quiet information. For many, winter darkness erased the urgency that governed life in brighter months. Without long days to fill, the pace of existence shifted. Work that required light was postponed or abandoned until spring. Instead, people focused on tasks that could be done slowly and repeatedly near the hearth. Repairing tools, mending clothing, and preparing materials occupied long evenings, accompanied by soft conversation or reflective silence. Time was no longer something to be spent efficiently, but something to endure patiently. The concept of waiting became central to winter life. Waiting for light, waiting for warmth, waiting for the return of longer days. This waiting was not passive, but accepted as part of the season's rhythm. Unlike modern impatience, which arises from constant stimulation, winter waiting existed within a framework of inevitability. There was no way to shorten the dark months. One could only move through them, adapting habits and expectations to match the slow progression of the season. Children learned early that winter followed different rules. Play moved indoors, Lessons were taught through stories, repetition, and observation rather than instruction. Elders passed time by recounting familiar events, reinforcing memory and continuity. Winter became the season in which the past was preserved, spoken aloud repeatedly as a way of maintaining connection when movement and novelty were limited. Darkness encouraged remembrance, turning attention toward what had already been experienced rather than what lay ahead. In regions farther north, where daylight all but vanished for weeks at a time, this effect intensified. The sun's absence altered not only routines, but emotional resilience. People marked the faintest signs of returning light with care, noticing changes in the sky that modern observers would overlook entirely. The first subtle lengthening of twilight was not celebrated loudly, but acknowledged quietly, as reassurance that winter, though dominant, was not permanent. Even in milder climates, winter darkness reshaped social bonds. Visits became rare and meaningful. Communities gathered less frequently, but with greater intention. Shared firelight took on importance beyond comfort, serving as a reminder of collective endurance. To sit together in the dark months was to affirm survival itself, reinforcing the idea that winter was faced not individually, but as a shared condition. As the season progressed, people adjusted mentally as much as physically. Expectations lowered, desires narrowed. Life contracted inward, becoming smaller in scale but deeper in repetition. This contraction was not seen as deprivation, but as a necessary response to the environment. Winter demanded less ambition and more acceptance, rewarding those who conserved energy and attention rather than expending them unnecessarily. In this way, winter without light did not simply remove brightness from the world. It reshaped human existence at its core. Time slowed, vision softened, silence deepened, and through it all, people learned to live within darkness, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a condition to be understood, endured, and eventually left behind when the light quietly and gradually returned. As winter deepened, the silence brought by snow became one of its most unfamiliar qualities. Snow did not simply cover the ground, it altered how the world sounded. Fresh snowfall absorbed noise, muting footsteps, voices, and distant activity, until villages seemed to exist inside a padded stillness. Sounds that once carried across fields in warmer months vanished almost entirely, replaced by a quiet so complete that it felt unnatural to those unaccustomed to it. For people living before modern noise, this silence was not peaceful in the modern sense, but strange, requiring adjustment and attention. In winter, the absence of sound became information in itself. People listened closely to what little could still be heard, learning to distinguish between normal quiet and troubling quiet. The crack of settling timber, the hiss of wind through eaves, or the distant call of an animal took on heightened significance. Snow trained the ear, forcing people to rely less on sight and more on subtle auditory cues to understand their surroundings. Silence was not empty, but layered, filled with meaning that demanded interpretation. Villages in winter often felt abandoned even when fully inhabited. Smoke rose quietly from chimneys, but little else betrayed human presence. Paths were softened or erased by snow, footsteps disappearing within hours. The sounds of work, conversation, and movement that defined daily life in warmer seasons were reduced to occasional murmurs indoors, outdoors. The world felt suspended, as though activity itself had paused. This quiet reshaped how people moved, spoke, and interacted with one another. For many, silence was unsettling precisely because it removed reassurance. In summer, sound confirmed life beyond the walls of a home. Voices, animals, and tools provided constant evidence of community. In winter, that evidence faded. A neighbor's absence could go unnoticed for days, sometimes weeks, simply because there was no sound to mark their presence. Silence forced trust in routines rather than confirmation, creating a sense of isolation even within settled areas. Snow also distorted distance. Without sound to guide perception, people misjudged how far away others were. A figure across a field appeared closer than it was. A voice seemed distant even when nearby. Winter darkness compounded this effect, making both sound and sight unreliable. This sensory uncertainty encouraged caution. People moved more slowly, spoke more deliberately, and avoided unnecessary activity that might lead them into confusion or fatigue. At night, the silence deepened further. Wind softened under snowfall. Wildlife retreated or moved cautiously. The familiar nighttime sounds of insects and birds were absent, leaving only the occasional creak of wood or distant movement across snow. In such conditions, people became acutely aware of their own presence. Breathing, shifting position, or stoking a fire sounded louder against the surrounding quiet, reinforcing a sense of enclosure within the home. Some historical accounts suggest that prolonged winter silence altered emotional states. Without constant auditory stimulation, people experienced heightened awareness of their thoughts. Reflection became unavoidable. For some, this quiet fostered contemplation and memory. For others, it intensified feelings of loneliness or melancholy. Winter silence removed distraction, leaving individuals alone with their inner world for long stretches of time. Despite this, silence was not universally feared. Over generations, people learned to accept it as part of winter's rhythm. Children grew up knowing that quiet months would come and that life would feel different during them. Elders taught patience through example, demonstrating how to occupy time without constant activity. Silence became normalized, even respected, as a sign that the world had settled into its winter state. In certain regions, silence was associated with safety. Heavy snowfall, that muffled sound, also slowed travel, reducing the likelihood of unexpected visitors or conflict. Communities understood that winter quiet brought a form of protection, limiting movement and encouraging people to remain close to home. In this way, silence functioned as both isolation and shelter, shaping social behavior as much as environmental conditions. The absence of sound also changed how people communicated. Conversations were quieter, measured, and often held close to the fire where voices carried more easily. Shouting was rare, unnecessary, and exhausting. Instead, people leaned closer, shared warmth, and spoke deliberately. Winter conversation became intimate by necessity, reinforcing bonds within households while limiting interaction beyond them. Snow's silencing effect extended even to timekeeping. In many communities, bells marked hours or gatherings during much of the year. In winter, heavy snow muffled their sound, rendering them unreliable. People could not always hear signals that once structured daily life, further dissolving rigid schedules. Time once again became something felt rather than measured, experienced through hunger, fatigue, and the slow passage of days. The silence of snow also influenced storytelling and memory. With fewer external sounds, spoken words carried greater weight. Stories told by the fire were not competing with noise, but filling a void. Each word lingered in the quiet, reinforcing attention and retention. Winter silence created ideal conditions for oral tradition, allowing narratives to unfold slowly and deliberately, uninterrupted by distraction. For those living in isolated homes or sparsely populated regions, winter silence could stretch for days without interruption. In such environments, even small sounds took on significance. The arrival of footsteps, the creak of a door, or the knock of snow from a roof became events, breaking the monotony and reminding inhabitants of connection beyond their immediate space. Silence heightened awareness of presence and absence alike. Over time, people adapted to this altered sensory world. The quiet no longer felt empty, but full in a different way. Snow, darkness, and silence merged into a single winter condition that shaped perception and behavior. Rather than resisting it, communities learned to move within it carefully, conserving energy and attention until sound, light, and movement gradually returned with the changing season. Winter silence was not simply the absence of noise. It was a defining feature of life before modern soundscapes, reshaping how people understood space, time, and one another. In the long, dark months, silence became a constant companion, teaching patience, attentiveness, and endurance through its persistent presence. Firelight in the pre-modern winter was far dimmer than most people imagine. Modern recreations often depict bright hearths filling rooms with warmth and illumination, but historical reality was far more subdued. Most household fires were built for heat and longevity, not brightness. Flames were kept low to conserve fuel, producing a soft, uneven glow that illuminated only a small area close to the hearth. Beyond that limited circle of light, rooms faded quickly into shadow, leaving corners, ceilings, and distant walls barely visible even to those accustomed to darkness. Candles, when available at all, were treated as precious resources, made from tallow or beeswax. They required labor, materials, and expense that most households could not afford to waste. A single candle might be lit only for specific tasks that demanded focused light, such as mending fine clothing or preparing tools. Once its purpose was complete, it would be extinguished rather than allowed to burn freely. For much of winter life, firelight alone defined the visual environment. This scarcity of light shaped how people moved within their homes. Steps were measured. Paths between doorways, tables, and sleeping areas were memorized rather than seen. People navigated familiar spaces by habit, touch, and sound, knowing where benches, tools, and hearthstones were positioned, even when they could not clearly see them. Movement became slow and deliberate, not out of fear, but because haste served no purpose in an environment where visibility was limited. Faces, too, were altered by firelight. Features appeared sharper or softer depending on the angle of flame. Expressions shifted with every flicker, making even familiar people look subtly unfamiliar at times. This changing illumination affected social interaction, encouraging people to sit close together where faces could be seen clearly. Distance within a room became a barrier, separating those within the light from those partially hidden in shadow. The constant presence of firelight also introduced movement into otherwise still spaces. Shadows stretched and contracted along walls, responding to the smallest changes in flame. Objects seemed to shift subtly as light played across their surfaces. This motion was not alarming, but it was constant, creating an environment where nothing appeared entirely fixed. Over long winter nights, this subtle movement became part of the sensory background of daily life. Smoke was an unavoidable companion to firelight. Even well-built hearths allowed smoke to linger indoors, especially in colder months when ventilation was limited. The smell of burning wood permeated clothing, hair, and skin. Soot accumulated slowly on walls and ceilings, darkening interiors further and absorbing what little light existed. Over time, rooms grew dimmer still, reinforcing the sense that winter was a season of visual contraction. Firelight dictated daily rhythms. Activities that required concentration were timed to coincide with moments of better illumination, while simpler tasks filled the darker hours. Reading, when possible, was often done aloud so that limited light could serve multiple people at once. Writing was rare in winter evenings, not because of cold, but because it demanded more light than most households could spare. Instead, memory and repetition became primary tools for preserving knowledge. The physical effort required to maintain firelight also shaped behavior. Fires needed constant attention, especially during long winter nights. Someone was always responsible for tending the hearth, adding fuel, adjusting airflow, and preventing sparks from escaping. This responsibility often fell to those who woke naturally during the night, reinforcing the segmented sleep patterns common in pre-modern societies. Firelight was both a necessity and a burden, demanding care even as it provided warmth and visibility. Children learned early how to exist within this dim world. They were taught where objects belonged and how to move carefully in low light. Play adapted to conditions, becoming quieter and more contained during winter evenings. Games relied less on vision and more on storytelling, rhythm, and imagination. Firelight shaped not only the physical environment, but also the forms of interaction that developed within it. In winter, light also influenced social hierarchy within the home. Those seated closest to the hearth occupied the brightest space, while others remained in shadow. This arrangement often reflected age, status, or task, subtly reinforcing social roles through proximity to light and warmth. The hearth became both a physical and symbolic center, organizing space and attention around itself. Extended exposure to firelight affected perception beyond the home as well. After spending hours indoors, stepping outside into moonlit snow could feel disorienting. Snow reflected light differently, creating a brightness that contrasted sharply with the dim interiors. Eyes needed time to adjust, reinforcing the sense that winter required constant adaptation between environments rather than effortless movement. Despite its limitations, firelight offered comfort precisely because of its scarcity. Its warmth and glow marked a boundary against the cold and darkness beyond the walls. The visible edge of light defined safety and belonging, even as it reminded inhabitants of what lay beyond it. Firelight did not banish darkness. It carved out small spaces within it, allowing life to continue in reduced but persistent form. Over time, people came to accept this half-lit existence as normal. Winter did not feel deprived in comparison to summer, but distinct. Expectation shifted accordingly. Visual clarity was not demanded. Instead, familiarity and memory replaced brightness as guides through daily life. Firelight taught patience, encouraging slower movement, quieter conversation, and a heightened awareness of in this way. Firelight shaped winter not as a season of total darkness, but as one of limited illumination. It created pockets of warmth and visibility within a world otherwise dominated by shadow. Living by firelight required adjustment, endurance, and attentiveness, qualities that defined winter life long before modern lighting transformed the night into something resembling day. Winter homes in the pre-modern world were shaped as much by darkness as by cold. Long before insulation materials, sealed windows, or controlled ventilation, people adapted their living spaces to survive months of low light, smoke, and stagnant air. Houses were not designed to be bright or spacious during winter, but to be efficient, enclosed, and manageable under conditions where heat and light were scarce. As the season deepened, homes effectively shrank, with families occupying fewer rooms and abandoning large portions of their dwellings until spring. Windows, which modern life treats as essential sources of light, were deliberately minimized in winter homes. Openings were small, often covered with animal hide, oiled cloth, wooden shutters, or later, thick glass that emitted little light. In colder regions, windows were sometimes partially blocked or sealed entirely to preserve heat, sacrificing illumination for warmth. Light that did enter during the day was brief and weak, filtered through snow, cloud, and low sun, offering little assistance once evening arrived. Smoke management further shaped winter architecture. Many homes lacked proper chimneys, relying instead on smoke holes or imperfect flues that allowed smoke to escape slowly. During winter, these openings were often restricted to prevent heat loss, causing smoke to linger indoors. Over time, soot-coated walls, beams, and ceilings, darkening interiors and reducing reflectivity. This accumulation made rooms progressively dimmer as winter wore on, reinforcing the sense that light retreated not only outside, but within the home itself. Ceilings were kept low to trap heat, further limiting the vertical spread of light. Firelight rarely reached above head height, leaving upper portions of rooms in constant shadow. Storage areas, sleeping lofts, and rafters remained unseen for much of the winter, accessed by memory rather than sight. The structure of the home encouraged downward focus, centering life around the hearth and discouraging unnecessary movement beyond it. Furniture arrangements shifted with the season. Tables, benches, and work surfaces were moved closer to the fire, creating compact living zones within larger rooms. Unused furniture was pushed into shadowed corners or stored away entirely. Winter life became spatially concentrated, with all essential activities occurring within a limited radius of heat and light. This compression of space altered social dynamics, bringing people into closer physical proximity for extended periods. The air within winter homes was heavy and layered. Smoke, breath, damp clothing, and the scent of stored food combined to create a persistent atmosphere that modern ventilation would quickly disperse. Windows were rarely opened, even briefly, as the loss of heat outweighed the benefit of fresh air. Instead, people endured the indoor environment as a trade-off for survival, accepting chronic discomfort as part of winter life. This indoor air affected health in ways that were poorly understood at the time. Chronic coughing, irritated eyes, and headaches were common during winter months, yet often accepted as seasonal conditions rather than ailments. The effects of smoke exposure accumulated slowly, shaping how people aged and how winter illnesses were perceived. In many cases, the physical toll of indoor living was inseparable from the season itself. Darkness within the home also influenced behavior. People avoided unnecessary movement in unlit areas, reducing accidents but also limiting activity. Children were discouraged from wandering after nightfall. Tools and objects were kept in fixed locations to prevent loss or injury. Order within the home was maintained not for cleanliness, but for navigability in low light. Familiarity replaced visibility as the primary means of orientation. Sleep-in arrangements reflected these constraints. Beds were often positioned near the hearth or in areas where residual warmth lingered. Entire families might sleep in a single room during the coldest months, abandoning separate chambers that could not be adequately heated. Privacy was secondary to warmth and safety, reinforcing communal living patterns that persisted throughout winter. Seasonal adjustments extended even to the exterior of homes. Doors were reinforced, additional coverings applied, and entrances reduced to limit heat loss. Some households created secondary interior barriers, hanging heavy cloths or wooden panels to block drafts and preserve warmth within occupied spaces. These modifications further reduced light penetration, creating layers of darkness that separated winter interiors from the outside world. Despite these conditions, winter homes were not perceived as oppressive by those who lived within them. Generations had adapted to the constraints, developing habits that made life manageable within dim, enclosed spaces. Darkness was not an obstacle to be overcome, but a condition around which life was organized. The home became a place of retreat rather than activity, designed to endure the season rather than resist it. Over time, these architectural adaptations shaped cultural expectations. Winter was understood as a period of contraction, when life narrowed in scope and pace. Homes reflected this understanding, offering shelter and continuity rather than comfort or brightness. In accepting darker, smaller spaces, people aligned themselves with the season's demands, conserving energy and attention until conditions changed. In this way, winter architecture did more than provide physical shelter. It reinforced a worldview in which endurance mattered more than expansion, and adaptation mattered more than control. Homes built for darkness taught patience and restraint, qualities that allowed communities to survive the long months until light and space gradually returned with spring. The body in winter, endurance, cold, and the slow narrowing of life. Winter without light did not merely change how people lived, it altered how the human body functioned, how time was perceived, and how survival itself was measured. In the long, dark months before modern heating, medicine, and reliable food storage, winter became a season of physical negotiation. Bodies slowed, movements became deliberate. Every action carried a cost in warmth, energy, and stored strength. Survival was not dramatic or heroic. It was quiet, patient, and often invisible. Cold shaped the body from the outside inward. Skin thickened, cracked, and hardened. Hands lost sensation first, fingers stiffening until tasks once simple, tying cord, shaping wood, repairing tools, required planning and pauses. Breath condensed constantly, and moisture froze along collars, beards, and hair. Clothing was layered not for comfort but necessity. Wool, fur, rough linen, reused and repaired until nothing remained to replace them. Even then, clothing was never enough. Cold seeped through seams, through gaps in walls, through the ground itself. Food intake changed as daylight vanished. Fresh food disappeared early, replaced by grains, preserved meats, dried roots, and whatever could survive months of storage. Diets narrowed. Meals became smaller and more repetitive. Hunger was not always sharp. More often it was dull and persistent. A background presence that reminded the body to conserve rather than expend. People learnt to eat slowly, not to savor, but to stretch what little warmth digestion could provide. Sleep followed the cold. Nights lengthened until rest and waking blurred together. People slept longer but not deeply, waking often as fires dimmed or cold pressed inward. Beds were not places of comfort but survival arrangements. Shared spaces, layered bedding, bodies positioned to reduce exposure. Sleep was lighter, fragmented, shaped by the need to remain aware of warmth, fire, and breathing. Dreams, when they came, were often vivid, shaped by darkness, hunger, and the body's constant, low-level stress. Movement outside was minimized. Villages contracted inward, activity reduced to essentials. Long journeys ceased, trade slowed or stopped entirely. Roads vanished beneath snow and ice, turning familiar paths into uncertain terrain. Winter was not the time for expansion or ambition. It was the time for preservation. Even speech changed. Conversation shorter, quieter, as breath itself was something to be managed. Illness thrived in winter's stillness. Cold weakened resistance, and cramped living conditions allowed sickness to spread slowly and persistently. Minor injuries lingered. Cuts healed slowly. Infections that might have been manageable in warmer months became dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited, and winter restricted access to remedies. Healing relied on rest, warmth, and endurance, none of which were plentiful. The body adapted by narrowing its world. Energy was rationed. Emotional expression soaked. People became inward-focused, attentive to small changes in sensation, numbness, stiffness, fatigue. Survival depended on listening to the body closely, respecting its limits, and avoiding unnecessary risk. Winter punished impatience more than weakness, and this physical narrowing influenced culture deeply. Winter was associated not with action but restraint, not with growth but waiting. Strength was measured by how little one needed, not how much one could take. Endurance was quiet and unsullied. Those who survived winter were not necessarily the strongest or boldest, but the most cautious, the most patient, the most aware of their own fragility. Even children learned these lessons early. Play moved indoors or stopped entirely. energy was conserved. Adults watched closely for signs of illness or weakness, knowing that winter offered little forgiveness. Elders, already physically diminished, were especially vulnerable, and many cultures accepted winter death as an expected passage rather than a tragedy. Survival itself was uneven, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Winter shaped memory as well. People remembered winters not by dates, but by sensations. The year the cold bit deeper. The year food ran thin. The year sickness lingered too long. Time became cyclical, measured by return rather than progress. Spring was not merely a season, it was relief, release, proof that endurance had meaning. In the long dark before modern times, the human body was not separate from winter. It was part of it. Cold entered muscle, bone, and breath, reshaping daily life from the inside out. Survival was not dramatic, and it was rarely spoken of in grand terms. It was felt instead in aching joints, shallow sleep, careful movements, and the constant, quiet effort of staying alive until the light returned. Winter without light reshaped not only daily routines, but the very idea of work itself. As daylight diminished and darkness dominated most hours, labor ceased to follow structured schedules and instead became responsive to conditions. Tasks were no longer assigned to times of day, but to moments when light, strength, and weather briefly aligned. Work slowed, not because people lacked discipline, but because winter demanded conservation. Energy spent unnecessarily could not be recovered, and mistakes carried consequences that extended far beyond inconvenience. Much of the labor that defined warmer seasons disappeared entirely. Fields lay dormant beneath snow and ice. Roads faded into indistinct lines, their surfaces reshaped by wind rather than feet or wheels. Construction halted. Trade slowed to a near standstill. What remained was not productive labor, but maintenance. The quiet effort of preserving tools, supplies, and bodies until conditions changed. Winter work did not create new things. It prevented loss. Tools themselves reflected this shift. Iron stiffened in the cold, wood contracted and split. Handles loosened, bindings frayed, and edges dulled more quickly under winter's strain. Repairs became constant and repetitive. A tool broken in winter could not easily be replaced, so mending took precedence over use. Even sharpening a blade required careful planning, as exposure to cold air and moisture could undo the effort quickly. Time felt heavier during the long dark. Without visible progress or seasonal markers, days blended together. Snowfall erased the evidence of previous days, smoothing the landscape into sameness. Weeks passed with little external change, reinforcing the sensation that time itself had slowed or stalled. People did not count days forward so much as they counted how much winter remained, measuring endurance rather than advancement. Movement across the land became limited and deliberate. Paths that once guided travel vanished beneath snowdrifts, leaving only memory to indicate where routes had been. Travelers relied on landmarks that could disappear overnight, a fence line buried by snow, a tree obscured by frost, a river concealed beneath ice. Winter travel required intimate knowledge of terrain, and even then it carried significant risk. Many chose not to travel at all, accepting isolation as safer than uncertainty. Animals altered their behavior in ways that affected human survival. Some disappeared entirely, retreating or migrating beyond reach. Others became scarce and unpredictable, their tracks visible one day and gone the next. Hunting in winter demanded patience and restraint, as pursuing prey across snow required far more energy than it returned. Failed hunts carried lasting consequences, depleting strength without replenishing stores. The land itself appeared empty during the deepest winter months. Fields that once showed signs of life became blank expanses. Rivers froze solid, their movement hidden beneath layered ice. Forests stood motionless, branches weighed down by snow, sound absorbed by the cold air. In this environment, the absence of activity became the dominant visual experience. Winter landscapes communicated stillness more than danger, reinforcing the idea that life had withdrawn rather than vanished. This stillness influenced human behavior profoundly. Without constant activity to observe, attention turned inward. Planning replaced actions. People thought ahead rather than outward, focusing on rationing, repair, and waiting. Winter encouraged a mindset oriented toward survival through restraint rather than effort. Those who succeeded were often those who did less, not more. Communities adjusted collectively to this slowed pace. Expectations diminished. Demands softened. Winter was understood as a time when productivity declined naturally and without blame. Survival was not judged by output but by continuity. To endure without loss was achievement enough. This understanding shaped social norms, reinforcing cooperation and discouraging excess during the darkest months. As winter progressed, the repetition of days created a unique relationship with time. Without milestones or visible change, patience became habitual. People learned to exist within extended waiting without expectation of immediate reward. This endurance shaped belief systems, traditions, and attitudes toward hardship. Winter taught that not all periods of life were meant for growth or progress. Some existed solely to be survived. By the heart of the long dark, the landscape and its people settled into a shared stillness. Snow accumulated layer by layer, smoothing the marks of human presence until villages seemed barely connected to the land around them. Roads slept beneath ice. Tools rested unused. Time itself felt suspended, held in place by cold and darkness. In this suspended state, winter revealed its true nature, not as a force of action, but as a condition of waiting that shaped every aspect of pre-modern life. Winter without light transformed the natural world in ways that were immediately visible to those who depended on it. Animals, once constant companions to daily life through hunting, farming, and husbandry, became unpredictable or disappeared entirely. As snow deepened and temperatures dropped, familiar patterns dissolved. Tracks that once guided hunters vanished beneath fresh snowfall. Migration routes shifted. Some species withdrew into forests or burrows, while others moved beyond reach altogether. Winter did not kill life outright, but it concealed it, forcing humans to confront absence rather than abundance. For people living before modern food systems, this disappearance carried serious consequences. Hunting success declined sharply as energy expenditure increased and returns diminished. Pursuing prey across snow required far more effort than in warmer months, and failure drained strength that could not be easily replaced. Many communities adjusted by reducing hunting activity, relying instead on stores prepared months earlier. Winter hunting became selective and cautious, focused on opportunity rather than pursuit. Domesticated animals faced their own trial. Livestock required feeding from dwindling reserves, forcing difficult decisions about which animals could be sustained through the winter. In some cases, weaker animals were slaughtered early to conserve resources. These choices were pragmatic rather than cruel, shaped by the understanding that winter demanded sacrifice to ensure survival. The presence of animals became less visible, confined to shelters or enclosures that offered limited protection from cold and darkness. The landscape itself reflected this withdrawal. Fields that once showed movement and activity became static expanses of snow. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. Barns and outbuildings stood silent, their functions reduced or suspended until spring. Rivers froze solid, hiding fish beneath opaque ice. Even forests felt emptied, their usual sounds muffled or absent. Winter stripped the land of visible life, leaving behind a surface that appeared barren despite what lay hidden beneath. Food storage became the central focus of survival. Wooden bins held grain, carefully protected from moisture and pests. Barrels contained salted meat, fish, or preserved vegetables, each opened sparingly. Roots and dried plants were stored in dark, cool spaces where they would not spoil. These stores represented months of labor compressed into static form, waiting to be consumed slowly and deliberately. Winter turned food into memory, reminding people of summer work with each measured portion. The act of eating itself changed during the long dark. Meals were repetitive and restrained. Variety disappeared, replaced by consistency. This monotony influenced mood and perception, dulling appetite while sharpening awareness of scarcity. People learned to eat not for pleasure, but for warmth and survival. Digestion became one of the few internal sources of heat, and meals were often timed to coincide with rest or sleep rather than activity. Animals that remained visible in winter took on heightened significance. Birds appearing near settlements were noticed immediately. Tracks crossing paths drew attention and speculation. Signs of life, however small, offered reassurance that the world beyond human shelter had not vanished entirely. These observations reinforced the habit of attentiveness, encouraging people to read the land closely for information about conditions and change. Winter also altered human-animal relationships culturally. Folklore and belief systems reflected the seasonal absence of animals, often attributing their disappearance to unseen forces rather than migration or hibernation. Stories explained why certain creatures withdrew and others endured, reinforcing respect for the rhythms of nature. These narratives were not entertainment alone, but frameworks for understanding a world that offered few immediate answers. As winter progressed, the slow depletion of stored food sharpened awareness of time. Each opened barrel, each emptied bin, marked the passage of days more clearly than any calendar. Survival became a calculation, balancing consumption against the unknown length of the season. Communities that misjudged this balance faced hunger long before spring, reinforcing the importance of foresight and restraint. Despite these hardships, winter did not erase life. It concealed it. Beneath snow and ice, plants rested. Animals endured in hidden forms. Rivers continued to move unseen. This understanding offered quiet reassurance, even as surfaces appeared lifeless. People learned to accept winter's illusion of emptiness, trusting that what was absent from view was not gone forever. In this way, winter without light reshaped how people related to the living world. It replaced immediacy with patience, abundance with conservation, and visibility with trust. Animals, food, and land all withdrew into quieter states, teaching humans to survive not by dominance or expansion, but by careful observation and endurance, until life, gradually and without announcement, returned. Winter without light did not introduce fear in the dramatic sense, but it did alter how people experienced uncertainty. In the long, dark months, fear became quieter, less specific, and more difficult to name. It was not tied to visible threats, but to absence, the absence of sound, movement, and confirmation. Without light, people could not easily verify what surrounded them, and this uncertainty shaped behavior more than any imagined danger ever could. At night, darkness removed context. Familiar spaces lost their clarity, and distances became difficult to judge. A sound outside a home could not be traced to its source. Footsteps might belong to wind, animals, or shifting snow. Wood settling in the cold produced sharp cracks that echoed briefly before being absorbed by silence. People learned not to react immediately, understanding that winter generated sounds without intention. Still, attention remained heightened, listening carefully before deciding whether action was necessary. This uncertainty extended beyond the home. Paths disappeared beneath snow, erasing familiar markers. A short journey, taken countless times in summer, could feel unfamiliar in winter darkness, even dangerous, not because of threat, but because orientation failed. People avoided unnecessary movement, not out of fear, but because winter punished misjudgment. Losing one's way, even briefly, could exhaust strength and expose the body to cold long enough to cause harm. Winter darkness also altered perception of time. Without visual confirmation of progress, waiting became ambiguous. People could not tell how long they had been awake or asleep. Hours passed unnoticed, creating the sensation that time itself had loosened its structure. This disorientation encouraged stillness. Rather than act impulsively, people learned to pause, conserve energy, and reassess conditions slowly. Fear in winter was often tied to isolation rather than intrusion. Silence raised questions not about what was present, but about what was missing. A neighbor unseen for days might simply be conserving resources, or might be ill. Winter made absence common and explanation uncertain. Communities accepted this ambiguity, understanding that immediate answers were not always possible. Concern existed quietly, without urgency, shaped by the knowledge that intervention itself carried risk. Darkness also softened emotional responses. Without visual stimulation, reaction slowed. Sudden movement was rare. Conversations were quieter, measured, and brief. People avoided loud speech or unnecessary noise, conserving breath and energy. This restraint extended to emotion itself. Expressions of excitement, anger, or fear were subdued, not suppressed deliberately, but tempered by the environment's demands. Winter encouraged a form of emotional economy. Feelings were experienced internally rather than expressed outwardly. Reflection replaced reaction. Long periods of darkness created space for memory, thought, and repetition. People revisited familiar ideas, stories, and concerns, not because they lacked imagination, but because winter favored what was known and reliable. Novelty required energy that could not be spared. Nighttime, in particular, emphasized this inward focus. With little to see, the mind filled the darkness with recollection rather than invention. Thoughts drifted toward past winters, past hardships, and past survival. Winter reinforced continuity rather than disruption. Each season echoed those before it, reminding people that endurance had precedent, that survival had already been achieved many times. This quiet form of fear differed significantly from later conceptions, shaped by artificial light and constant visibility. Without bright illumination, darkness was not shocking or threatening. It was expected. What unsettled people was not darkness itself, but change within it, an unfamiliar sound, an unexpected draft, a delay that exceeded expectation. These small deviations carried weight precisely because winter conditions made investigation difficult. As a result, winter behavior favored caution over curiosity. People resisted the impulse to investigate every anomaly. Instead, they learned to wait, observe, and respond only when necessary. This restraint reduced risk and conserved energy, reinforcing survival strategies developed over generations. Winter taught that not every uncertainty demanded action. Belief systems reflected this relationship with the unknown, rather than focus on visible threat. Winter folklore often centered on boundaries, thresholds, transitions, and moments of change. The unknown was associated with crossing rather than confrontation. This perspective aligned with lived experience, where danger arose not from attack, but from exposure, misjudgment, or overextension. The absence of clear sensory information also fostered trust in routine. Familiar patterns provided reassurance when external confirmation was unavailable. Repeating tasks, maintaining schedules based on habit rather than observation, and preserving structure within the home helped counteract uncertainty. Routine became a form of protection, anchoring daily life within predictable boundaries. In this way, winter darkness reshaped fear into something diffuse and manageable. It did not provoke panic or dramatize danger. Instead, it encouraged awareness, patience, and restraint. People learned to live alongside uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. This quiet endurance distinguished winter survival from other seasonal challenges, reinforcing a worldview shaped by acceptance rather than resistance. Winter without light did not teach people to fear the dark. It taught them to live within it, to recognize its limits, and to respect the boundaries it imposed. Fear became less about what might appear, and more about how far one could safely move, act, or decide before waiting became the wiser choice. In this way, darkness shaped not terror, but judgment, a subtle but essential skill in a world where light could not be relied upon. Winter without light placed unusual importance on the human voice. In the absence of visual stimulation, spoken words became one of the few active elements within the long dark. People talked not only to communicate information, but to confirm presence, continuity, and connection. Speech filled silence in a way that sight could not, creating structure where darkness removed it. Winter nights were long, and voices helped anchor time when hours could not be clearly measured. Conversation during winter differed from speech in brighter seasons. It was quieter, slower, and more deliberate. Words were chosen carefully, not for persuasion or entertainment, but for endurance. Talking required energy, breath, and warmth, all of which were limited. As a result, people spoke when it mattered, allowing silence to dominate the space between exchanges. This rhythm shaped how stories were told and remembered. Storytelling in winter served a different function than in other seasons. It was not about novelty or excitement, but repetition. Familiar stories were retold exactly, often word for word, preserving details through consistency rather than variations. This repetition reinforced memory and offered reassurance. In a season defined by uncertainty and waiting, familiar narratives provided structure and predictability. Knowing what came next in a story mirrored the hope that winter itself followed a known pattern. Many stories told during winter focused on endurance rather than conflict. They emphasized patience, caution, and survival rather than triumph or conquest. Characters waited, endured hardship, and learned restraint. These narratives reflected lived experience, reinforcing values that were necessary for winter survival. Stories became tools for teaching behavior appropriate to the season, embedding lessons subtly rather than instructively. Reading aloud, when possible, served a similar purpose. Books were scarce, and reading silently required more light than most households could spare. Instead, a single reader shared text with others, extending limited illumination across multiple listeners. The voice became a shared resource, transforming private knowledge into communal experience. Listening replaced viewing as the primary means of absorbing information. Winter also strengthened the role of elders as keepers of memory. With limited movement and activity, knowledge passed verbally became central to community continuity. Elders recalled past winters, sharing experiences of scarcity, illness, and endurance. These recollections were not dramatic, but instructive, offering reassurance that survival was possible because it had already occurred before. Memory functioned as proof rather than nostalgia. Silence remained an integral part of this vocal culture. Speech did not eliminate quiet, it punctuated it. Long pauses were common, accepted, and expected. People listened not only to words, but to tone, breath, and cadence. Listening became an active skill, heightened by the absence of competing sounds. Winter trained attention toward subtle human signals, reinforcing empathy and awareness. The act of speaking also shaped emotional regulation. Expressing fear, frustration, or grief aloud helped prevent isolation without escalating emotion. Winter discouraged extremes, favoring moderation and steadiness. Conversation provided an outlet that was controlled and contained, allowing feelings to be acknowledged without overwhelming limited communal resources. Outside the home, voices were rare. Snow and distance absorbed sound quickly, making speech impracticable beyond close proximity. This contrast heightened the significance of indoor voices. reinforcing the boundary between interior safety and exterior uncertainty. The human voice marked inhabited space, distinguishing it from the surrounding darkness. Over time, winter speech patterns became habitual. People adjusted their volume, pacing, and content to match the season. These adaptations persisted across generations, shaping cultural norms around communication. Winter favored listening over speaking, repetition over invention, and quiet presence over expression. In the absence of visual distraction, voices carried memory forward. Stories, advice, and shared experiences accumulated gradually, building a collective understanding of winter that extended beyond any single season. The spoken word became a bridge across time, connecting past endurance to present survival. Winter without light taught people that silence was not emptiness, and that speech did not need to dominate to matter. Within the long, dark, voices offered continuity rather than distraction, reinforcing patience and connection in a world where waiting was unavoidable. In this way, winter shaped communication into something slower, steadier, and deeply human, a quiet counterbalance to the stillness that surrounded it. Winter without light placed the human body under prolonged strain. An illness was a constant, unremarkable presence during the dark months. Sickness did not arrive suddenly or dramatically, but accumulated slowly as cold, hunger, and confinement weakened resistance. Many ailments were seasonal, appearing reliably each winter and fading when light and warmth returned. People recognized these patterns without fully understanding their causes, accepting illness as part of the season rather than an exceptional event. Cold affected the body in subtle but persistent ways. Joints stiffened, muscles weakened, circulation slowed, making extremities numb and unresponsive. These changes increased fatigue and reduced mobility, limiting what people could accomplish each day. Winter illness was often characterized not by acute symptoms, but by prolonged weakness that lingered for weeks or months. Recovery was slow, constrained by the same conditions that caused decline. Respiratory problems were common. Smoke-filled interiors, irritated lungs already stressed by cold air. Coughing became a familiar sound during winter nights, echoing softly in enclosed spaces. Breathing difficulties were rarely treated directly, as remedies were limited and understanding incomplete. Instead, rest and warmth were prescribed informally, reinforcing winter's emphasis on stillness rather than intervention. Digestive issues also emerged as diets narrowed. Preserved foods lacked variety and freshness, affecting overall health. Malnutrition did not always present as starvation, but as reduced resilience. Wounds healed more slowly. Infections persisted longer. The body's ability to recover diminished gradually, often unnoticed until strength failed entirely. Winter illness blurred the line between sickness and seasonal decline. Communal living arrangements influenced how illness spread and was managed. Shared spaces increased exposure, but isolation was rarely an option. Instead, communities adapted by redistributing labor and responsibility. Those able to work did more, while the weak rested. Winter demanded flexibility rather than strict roles. Survival depended on collective adjustment rather than individual recovery. Medical knowledge offered little certainty. Remedies were drawn from tradition, observation, and belief, often involving rest, warmth, and time rather than cure. Many winter illnesses were understood as imbalances rather than infections, attributed to cold, dampness, or seasonal forces. This framework emphasized endurance rather than eradication, aligning treatment with the realities of winter life. Mental health, though not recognized as such, was also affected. Extended darkness and isolation produced lethargy, melancholy, and withdrawal. These states were often accepted as normal winter conditions rather than causes for concern. Emotional dullness was tolerated, even expected, during the long dark. Communities understood that energy would return with the light, and patience was extended accordingly. Death, when it occurred in winter, was not always perceived as sudden tragedy. Elderly and infirm individuals often declined steadily through the season, their passing viewed as part of winter's toll. This acceptance did not diminish grief, but it shaped expectations. Winter was recognized as a time when life contracted, and loss was woven into the season's narrative. Despite this, winter illness also reinforced care and attentiveness. Small gestures mattered greatly. Sharing warmth, tending fires, providing food. These acts sustained not only the body but the sense of continuity necessary to endure prolonged hardship. Illness reminded communities of vulnerability, strengthening bonds through necessity rather than sentiment. As winter progressed, the accumulation of fatigue and illness sharpened awareness of time. Each surviving day carried weight. Recovery was measured not by improvement, but by stability, the absence of further decline. This perspective reflected winter's broader lesson. Survival did not require triumph, only persistence. In the long dark before modern medicine, illness was inseparable from the season itself. It shaped daily life quietly, influencing movement, conversation, and expectation. Winter did not demand constant action in response to sickness. Instead, it required acceptance, care, and waiting qualities that allowed people to endure until conditions changed. Winter without light revealed the body's limits clearly and without embellishment. It exposed fragility without dramatizing it, teaching communities to live with weakness as part of seasonal rhythm. In this way, illness became another aspect of winter's restraint, reinforcing the understanding that not all suffering could be resolved immediately, and that endurance itself was often the only available remedy. Winter without light dismantled the familiar markers by which time was usually understood. Without long daylight hours, clear shadows, or predictable schedules. People relied on subtle and indirect methods to sense the passage of days. Time was not something that could be checked at a glance. It had to be inferred, felt, and remembered. Winter transformed time from a visible sequence into an internal experience shaped by repetition, and in natural cycles became the primary reference. The moon offered one of the few reliable indicators of progression, its phases visible even through cold haze and cloud. People noticed its changing position and brightness, associating certain tasks or expectations with its movement. The moon did not provide precision, but it offered reassurance that time continued to move forward, even when days felt indistinguishable from one another. Snow itself served as an informal record. Layers accumulated gradually, each fall smoothing the marks left before it. People learned to recognize recent snowfall by texture and color, distinguishing fresh powder from older, compacted layers. Drifts reshaped by wind suggested how long the weather had held. These observations did not produce dates, but they allowed people to sense duration. How long the land had remained cold, how deeply winter had settled. Within homes, small habits replaced formal timekeeping. Fires were tended at regular intervals determined by necessity rather than hours. Ashes accumulated in patterns that reflected days of use, sometimes deliberately left undisturbed to mark continuity. Simple notches cut into wood, knots tied into cord, or stones moved from one place to another offered crude but effective reminders of passing days. These methods varied widely, shaped by local tradition rather than universal practice. Communal signals also played a role. Church bells, when audible through snow and wind, marked gatherings and rituals rather than exact times. In winter, their sound was unreliable, muffled by weather or distance. This inconsistency reinforced flexibility. People did not rush to meet precise moments, but responded when conditions allowed. Winter taught that time was shared rather than owned, experienced collectively rather than individually. The loss of rigid timekeeping altered social expectations. Punctuality, as understood today, held little meaning. Delays were normal and accepted. A visit postponed by weather or darkness required no explanation. This tolerance reduced pressure and conflict, aligning social behavior with environmental reality. Winter encouraged patience not as a virtue, but as a necessity. Memory played an essential role in navigating time. People remembered how many winters they had endured, how long certain cold periods lasted, and what signs preceded change. These memories formed a mental calendar more reliable than written records under winter conditions. Elders often served as living repositories of seasonal knowledge, recalling patterns that helped others anticipate what lay ahead. Time in winter also became cyclical rather than linear. Progress was not measured by advancement, but by survival. Each day endured brought the community closer to spring, even if that closeness could not be seen. This perspective shaped attitudes toward effort and ambition. Winter was not a time to push forward, but to hold steady. As the season deepened, people watched closely for the smallest changes. A slight lengthening of twilight, a shift in the quality of light at midday, subtle differences in the behavior of animals or the texture of snow. These signs carried immense significance, signaling that winter's hold was not absolute. Observation replaced calculation, reinforcing attentiveness to the environment. The absence of clocks and calendars did not make time meaningless. Instead, it made time intimate. People experienced it through their bodies, their surroundings, and their shared routines. Hunger marked hours, fatigue marked days, memory marked seasons. Winter compressed time inward, encouraging reflection rather than measurement. In this way, winter without light reshaped humanity's relationship with time itself. It removed precision and replaced it with awareness. It discouraged haste and rewarded patience. Time became something lived rather than tracked, endured rather than managed. This understanding persisted across generations, shaping cultures that accepted waiting as a natural part of life. When spring finally approached, its arrival was not announced by a date, but recognized through change. Time revealed itself through light returning gradually, through snow loosening its grip, and through renewed movement in the land. Until then, winter time remained quiet, internal, and shared a reminder that existence could continue without constant measurement. Winter without light demanded a particular state of mind, one shaped less by action than by endurance. Survival through the long dark was not achieved by constant effort, but by restraint, patience, and an acceptance of limitation. People learned that winter punished those who resisted its pace and rewarded those who adapted to it. This mindset was not philosophical in the abstract, but practical, reinforced daily by the consequences of overexertion and mischief. Endurance in winter was quiet and continuous. It did not appear as dramatic struggle, but as the steady refusal to exhaust limited resources. People conserved strength by reducing movement, limiting speech, and narrowing focus. Ambition faded, replaced by attention to immediate needs. This narrowing of life was not experienced as loss, but as alignment with the season's demands. To endure winter was to understand what could be postponed and what could not. Patience became habitual rather than aspirational. Waiting was unavoidable, and over time it became normalized. People waited for light, for warmth, for food, for news, and for change. This waiting carried no promise of immediate reward. It existed simply because it had to. Winter taught that some conditions could not be altered through effort alone, and that survival often depended on the willingness to remain still until circumstances shifted. This endurance mindset shaped social behavior. Expectations softened, productivity declined without judgment. Communities recognized that winter reduced capacity and adjusted accordingly. Cooperation replaced competition. Tasks were shared or deferred. The measure of contribution changed from output to presence. To remain alive and capable through winter was contribution enough. Emotionally, winter endurance required moderation. Excessive fear, hope, or despair drained energy that could not be replaced. People learned to temper emotional responses, maintaining a steady internal state rather than reacting to each hardship. This emotional restraint was not suppression, but adaptation. It allowed individuals to persist without being overwhelmed by the season's cumulative strain. The rhythm of winter reinforced this mindset. Days passed with little variation, creating a sense of continuity rather than progression. This repetition reduced urgency. Without frequent change, people stopped anticipating immediate outcomes. Instead, they focused on maintaining stability from one day to the next. Winter endurance was measured not by milestones reached, but by consistency preserved. Belief systems reflected this emphasis on patience. Rather than promising rescue or transformation, many winter traditions emphasized balance, respect for natural cycles, and acceptance of hardship. Winter was framed as a necessary period of restraint that made future renewal possible. These beliefs reinforced the idea that endurance itself held value, even when improvement was not visible. The physical environment supported this mindset. Snow muffled sound, darkness limited vision, cold discouraged excess movement. Together, these conditions reduced stimulation, making stillness easier to maintain. Winter created an external environment that mirrored the internal state required to endure it. The world slowed, and people slowed with it. Children absorbed this mindset through observation. They learned that winter demanded different behavior than other seasons. Play was quieter, curiosity was tempered, risk was discouraged. These lessons were not always articulated, but reinforced through daily routine. Winter endurance became part of cultural inheritance, passed down through lived experience rather than instruction. As the long dark progressed, endurance became self-reinforcing. Each survived day confirmed that patience worked. Each conserved resource validated restraint. Over time, winter survival shaped identity, reinforcing a sense of capability rooted not in strength or speed, but in persistence. People understood themselves as capable of enduring conditions that could not be hurried or avoided. This mindset did not disappear with the return of light. It lingered, influencing how people approached other forms of hardship. Winter endurance taught that life contained periods of waiting that could not be filled with activity or distraction. It taught that value existed in holding steady rather than advancing. These lessons persisted long after the snow melted. In the long dark before modern times, endurance was not celebrated loudly or recorded formally. It was assumed, expected, and shared. People survived winter not by conquering it, but by aligning with its rhythm. This alignment shaped cultures that understood patience as strength and restraint as wisdom. Qualities forged not through comfort, but through the quiet demands of surviving the long dark. Winter without light did not end suddenly. There was no clear moment when darkness released its hold, or when life shifted back into motion. Instead, change arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, through subtle signs that required attention to notice. A faint lengthening of daylight at the edges of morning. A softer quality to the cold. A difference in how shadows rested on snow. These changes did not announce themselves. They revealed themselves only to those who had learned to wait. People who lived through the long dark understood that winter loosened its grip slowly. The first signs of change were often uncertain, easily dismissed as temporary variation rather than true transition. A brighter afternoon might be followed by days of deep cold. Snow might soften briefly before freezing again. Experience taught caution. Hope was measured carefully, tempered by memory of winters that lingered longer than expected. As light returned incrementally, it did not immediately restore activity. Life expanded cautiously, testing conditions rather than assuming them. Movement increased only slightly. Tasks postponed during winter were approached gradually. The habits formed during months of restraint did not vanish overnight. Winter endurance lingered in posture, routine, and expectation. The land reflected this slow awakening. Snow shifted rather than disappeared, collapsing inward rather than melting cleanly away. Ice fractured and refroze repeatedly. Forests remained still, even as light changed. The environment signaled transition through nuance rather than spectacle. Those who survived winter were attuned to these details, reading them as confirmation rather than promise. Emotionally, the return of light did not erase the effects of the long dart. Fatigue remained. Bodies required time to recover from months of conservation. Strength returned gradually, accompanied by a cautious awareness of vulnerability. Winter had taught limits clearly, and those lessons were not easily forgotten. Communities responded similarly. Social life expanded, but slowly. Visits resumed, work resumed. Yet winter's influence shaped expectations. People remained mindful of resource use, effort, and risk. The patience learned during darkness informed how spring was approached. Winter endurance did not end. Its memory played an important role in this transition. People remembered how long the dark had lasted, how close scarcity had come, how illness and fatigue had accumulated. These memories informed preparation for the next cycle. Winter was never truly past. It was anticipated again, even as it faded. Survival depended on remembering rather than forgetting. Over generations, this rhythm-shaped worldview. Life was understood as cyclical, not progressive. Periods of expansion followed contraction. Periods of light followed darkness. Neither was permanent. Winter without light reinforced the understanding that endurance mattered as much as growth, and that waiting was not failure, but alignment with reality. Modern life, filled with constant illumination and uninterrupted activity, obscures this understanding. Artificial light compresses night. Climate control removes seasonal strain. Time accelerates rather than stretches. Yet the human body and mind still carry echoes of winter endurance, responding to darkness, silence, and stillness in ways shaped by long history. To listen to the quiet history of winter without light is to remember a way of living that accepted limitation without panic and waiting without complaint. It is to recognize that much of human resilience was built not through conquest or speed, but through patience, restraint, and attention to small changes. As the light returned in the past, it did so gently, without demand for celebration. Life resumed because it could, not because it was commanded to. Winter released its hold not as a defeated force, but as a completed cycle. And so this story ends as winter once did, not with certainty, but with gradual change, with light returning quietly, with movement resuming carefully, with endurance giving way slowly to possibility. You may rest here, in the space between darkness and light, where waiting has meaning and change arrives without urgency.